To be remembered here is that while millions of people took to the streets in this country, and you saw no reflection within the political system of that type of energy, we can't forget that at the beginning of the war on terror, Labour, as a party, had 30,000 shares in BAE Systems, an arms company which benefited massively from the war in Iraq and the war on terror in general. One would have to ask where insider trading begins and politics ends, especially when thinking of somebody like Tony Blair, who we will get onto in a second. So while millions of people mobilized across this country, you saw an estimated 36 million people across 3,000 demonstrations across the world mobilized against this war. And doesn't that say something about how malignant the military-industrial complex actually is, when in the face of this type of opposition, all the governments could respond with was a loss of civil liberties. They could not assimilate this type of energy into the political system. And in the first month of the US occupation, you saw 29,199 bombs dropped in Iraq. Every single one of those bombs was worth a huge amount of money to companies linked both to the British government, but also to the US government. It's a war that's led to 1 in 25 Iraqis being displaced. And you have seen since that time, the United States spend $32 million per hour on war. We also know that overall, the war on terror entailed an estimated 46 bombs being dropped per day for 20 years. This is immense, what we have lived through. And on the mention of Fallujah, it's important to remember that the series of events initially was that the United States occupied a primary school. People came out to protest against the occupation of the primary school. They were fired upon by the US military. People died. And then another demonstration following those deaths was fired upon by the US military. Of course, we know that a series of events led to white phosphorus and depleted uranium being used on that civilian population. And you saw a 17-fold increase in leukemia there and a 10-fold increase in breast cancer. And in fact, someone as eminent as Noam Chomsky has gone as far to say that the effect on people's health when it comes to cancers is worse than that has been seen in Hiroshima. Now, what of Tony Blair? Well, many would look at arguments like saying, oh, it was for oil, as unsophisticated, as cheap, as crude, pardon the pun. But actually, Tony Blair, when he exited Downing Street, went directly into a job as an advisor for the oil company UI Energy. Now that was exactly the same period that UI Energy acquired 3 Iraqi oil fields. We also have to remember that Tony Blair was paid £1 million a year as an advisor to the Mubadala Development Fund in the UAE. At the very same time that Mubadala was claiming it was developing a plan to extract $1 trillion worth of minerals and resources from Afghanistan. Now, during that period of the CPA ruling in Iraq, you actually found established an unregulated space for capital accumulation for foreign companies. And according to the US government appointed auditor, you had at least $12 billion of revenue, which was appropriated by this government, this CPA regime, that was not actually adequately accounted for. Now, when people talk about reparations for Iraq, we wonder what reparations, because actually reparations were given for the invasion. But do you know who the reparations were given to? Through a system that the United States had established, companies could claim for lost income during the previous rule to 2003, meaning that Shell, that Halliburton, that ExxonMobil, that KFC, that Pepsi, that Toys R Us, all were given reparations for the Iraq War. In fact, Israeli travel agents and hotel companies were given $15 million as reparation for the Iraq War. This was really a transfer of funds in the upwards direction. We also have to remember that just 1 week before the occupation, the largest no-bid contract in US history was awarded to Kellogg Brown and Root as part of what they called Operation Restore Iraqi Oil. Now, Kellogg Brown and Root was a subsidiary of Halliburton. The Vice President of the United States at the time, Dick Cheney, was the former head of Halliburton. We also know the way companies that making a killing in Iraq and Afghanistan have actually, and this is something that there needs to be more clear thinking about in this country specifically, when we look at, for example, Khaki International. Now, Abu Ghraib, the torture which took place there, implicates this company, Khaki International. Not only have Khaki International not been punished for employing half of the interrogators in that prison. No, far from that. Khaki International, after that, won the right to deliver the census in Scotland. Worse than that, Lockheed Martin, who through the war on terror increased the value of their shares by 1,200%, also were contracted as interrogators in Guantanamo Bay. Lockheed Martin delivered the census in this country in 2010. What about the data company Palantir? This was set up to process the data of people in the territories occupied by the United States as part of the war on terror. It did not exist before the war on terror, and it would not have existed without the war on terror. Well, today, Palantir has our data as part of an NHS deal. This is what has happened. The ghouls of the war on terror came home. And of course, we know that when you look at these policies that were put in place by the CPA in that period, there were 100 legally binding administrative orders. And one of them particularly, it was Order 39. It allowed for the full private ownership of state-owned enterprises and led to over 200 state-owned functions being taken over by private companies. Those included electricity, telecommunications, pharmaceutical, and it also allowed 100% foreign ownership of banks. Now, Article 55 of the Hague Regulations says it is illegal for an occupying force to privatize the assets of another country. And that is exactly what happened. So what we're talking about is millions of layers of illegality within this process. You know, these 100 legally binding orders that Bremer put in place include the deregulation of wage protection in the labour market. Of course, a labour law did not take place until 2015. It was only then that people had protections in very vital parts of the collective bargaining process. And so overall, what we saw is in the midst of the invasion and the occupation, more than 500,000 Iraqi citizens losing their job, and then later on, over 50% of the workforce becoming unemployed, at least. We also know that George Bush made the Executive Order 13303, which actually gave immunity from prosecution for theft or embezzlement of Iraqi oil or any corporate crime around the oil question. We even saw the stopping of pesticides being applied to the date trees, and of course they take 15 years or so to mature, so it completely destroyed that key economy in the country. We saw the leather industry immediately fall from employing 200,000 people to only employing 20,000 people. So where do we find ourselves now? We find ourselves in actually a more difficult place to argue against the imperialism of our own government and our own state. We have to remember that at that time, the British elite split in many different ways. This is why you would get the case of David Kelly, for example. It's why you would get Greg Dyke and others within this part of the public sphere being forced into different positions because the British elite was split. However, on all of the other examples of assertions of military force, we have not seen the same splits develop. And one of the interesting things that struck me the other day is so many of us are shocked at this incestuous revolving door relationship between the intelligence services and our media, when actually we look back at one of the founders, the first Director General of MI5, Vernon Kell. He was simultaneous to being an intelligence officer, a correspondent for the Daily Telegraph in China. This is not new. This is the way our class system functions in this country. We're governed by a combination of media and political pantomime. And so while we thought that surely what we were doing would somehow slow down the war machine, what we actually saw was our own civil liberties and rights taken away more and more across these years. And what we have to be clear about is that the United States, and Britain for that matter, will never ever again be in a position where they can do what they have done in Iraq and Afghanistan. That kind of assertion of force will simply not be possible. Because in addition to some of the things that have been mentioned so far, you've seen not only the government in Iraq, but even the government now in Saudi Arabia agreeing to trade with China in currencies other than the dollar. This is the beginning of de-dollarization. The war in Ukraine has consolidated US power in Europe, but it's actually lost much of the rest of the world and seemingly much of the Gulf, surprisingly. So we are seeing a time when these kind of assertions of force will be less possible. And it's important that here we draw on the tradition of anti-war activism in this country to make sure that next time they try to do these kind of operations, we are out there in big, big numbers and we are stopping them in every way we can. Thank you very much.